This person writes, screen admission for elementary grades through G&T and for middle school programs are exacerbating segregation in our district. How will you help us integrate our schools, our classrooms, and our district?
So, great question. So let me be even more specific. So if, as the Chancellor, I was to circumvent every CEC, which is your elected body, if I was to circumvent every elected official, and to say, as the Chancellor, as I put on my crown, we will now integrate every school, we will get rid of every screened admission, we will eliminate any barrier to open enrollment in every single school. How well would that go over? Because at the end of the day, we're a democracy. You have to have a conversation. People have to engage. And while I think that very enlightened individuals may sometimes disagree, it's not necessarily the agreement that's important. It's the process of having the conversation and having your voice heard. That's why I talk about a bottom-up approach from the people. You have to have that kind of a conversation. That conversation is starting to happen. And that conversation is being supported by us. We made the announcement when the mayor and I approved the District 15 integration plan. There's a $2 million now grant program that we are going to make available to community education councils for engaging in that kind of a process building to have those conversations. But let me just tell you what I, Richard Carranza, Chancellor of the New York Department of Education, thinks about this issue. I recently came to New York City. I was born in Tucson, Arizona, but I most recently came from Houston, Texas. Now, when I'm in Houston, Texas, Houston is kind of the blueberry and the cherry pie politically in Texas. Very red state, very conservative state. And here I am, this flaming liberal, talking about, lots of really liberal things, like all kids going to school together, right? Wasn't always very well received. And when I had the opportunity to come to New York, I thought, okay, so I taught American government as a teacher for over a decade. And when I talked about, the liberal politics, and I thought about open and progressive ideas, New York was always one of those cities and states that I always talked to my students about. So excited to get to New York City. Can't wait to get to New York City. I am eager. My eyes are open, my ears are open, and I'm looking and I'm watching. And what I find is a system that is systematically locking out kids from opportunities in schools, sometimes right around the neighborhood. The system of screens, the system of tests. So for me, because public schools for me and my brother, two English language learners from blue-collar parents in the desert of Tucson, Arizona, were the cornerstone of our ability to actually achieve the American dream. The public schools, to me, are the cornerstone of our democracy. And if they are the cornerstones of our democracy, then, and public schools, and I'm going to underline, belong to the public, then the notion that the public would be shut out, or a segment of the public would be shut out of any school that belongs to the public, to me, just doesn't align to what we feel is the role of a public school in American society. Add to that the fact of this. So I was a principal as well. So if I'm in a district where, and let's just say I'm an elementary school principal, and in my district there are 50 elementary schools, and of those 50 elementary schools, 40 of them have screens. And the screens mean that you have to have certain grades, or you have to have certain tests, that you have to have certain interviews with parents, and then someone or something gets to decide if you come to that elementary school. Well, it sounds all fine and good. If you get into that elementary school, I got into that elementary school, right? But what about the kids that don't? Those kids then, and this is where we set up this, I call it the self-defeating cycle. Those kids then have to go somewhere. And where do they go? They go to the elementary schools that don't have screens, that takes everybody. And what ends up happening? Typically those students are going to be students that have conditions or circumstances that could be tough. Intergenerational poverty, it could be that they're foster kids, it could be their kids in temporary housing, it could be that they're English language learner, developing bilingual students, you name it. What invariably then happens, and just look at what happens in New York City, is that at the end of the year, all the students take the same state assessment. And when those state assessment scores come due, Everybody gets hot and bothered and they write about it. The Daily News is writing about it. The Post is writing about it. They're comparing everybody to everybody. And you've already set up those 10 schools out of those 50 schools that don't have any screens to be less well performing on those tests. And then what ends up happening? Then in Spanish we call it the chisme. But in English we call it the word on the street. So the word on the street then becomes, ooh, you don't want to go to that elementary school, look at their test scores. You want to go to that elementary school because look at their test scores. Nobody ever talks about, well, some are screening for certain kids and some are not screening for certain kids. Nobody ever wants to know about, well, the schools that you say have low test scores, look at where they've moved their kids. They've had incredible growth over 1 year, and they may not be at the same exact level as a school that's being screened, but those kids move just this much, while those kids move this much. They never get credit for that. All they get credit for, and they get denounced for, is that they have lower test scores. That's but one of many negative consequences of having screened schools. I will also tell you that I'm doing my homework, and as I've studied the history of screens in New York City, it goes back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, folks, I'll tell you right now as we speak, in New York City, 70% of our students are Black or Latino students. 70%. Now, some people will say, well, what does that have to do with me? What it has to do with all of us is if we don't educate all of our students, including that 70%, then what ends up happening is that eventually yours and mine, our taxes are going to be supporting people that are not going to be contributing members of society. We're not going to be sending kids to college. We're not going to be sending kids into productive careers in the future. So it belongs to all of us. But I guarantee you that the 70% of our students that are Black and Latino right now, it's not the same demographics that we had in the 1970s in New York City. It's a different demographic. But yet some of those systems of screens and segregation and segregative policies are germinated in the 1970s. And I'm going to say something because I'm just going to be honest with you. I learned as a teacher that if you're fake, your students will know that in 5 seconds flat. And you're going to know that if I'm fake, you're going to catch me in 5 seconds flat. So I'm going to just be honest with you. As I've done my history, you know what one of the main reasons for the systems of screens and segregating policies is we were worried of losing white middle-class families from the New York City Department of Education. That was a concern. We were losing enrollment. So we made it so that we could have screens so that all families could still send their kids to school and say, I'm very progressive. I send my kids to the public schools, but I don't have to live my progressivism. My kids still don't have to go to school with Black or brown kids. Now I know that sounds very harsh, and I know that sounds a little tough. Check the history. So my whole point around the issue of segregation and integration of our schools is that as New Yorkers, as that very enthusiastic educator that came from Texas to New York, that knows that New Yorkers are progressive, we can do this. That's not who we are as New Yorkers. I don't believe that. I don't see that. I know that's not who we are. I think we could actually lead the nation in being very enlightened about how we integrate our schools that makes sense, that communities can buy into, and that we know that when schools are integrated, everybody does better. So my goal is very simple. I want to live for the day where nobody says New York City's public schools are the most segregated in America, but for the day when people say New York City has done the hard work and they are no longer the most segregated. They are actually leading the nation in showing us how we can actually have enlightened integration in New York City.